The following program is brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, James Schrepfer, and on this episode, I am joined by Father Anthony Cekada of St. Gertrude the Great Church in Westchester, Ohio. Father, so good of you to join us this evening.
Always happy to be here, and always happy, I guess, to be involved in a good controversy.
On this episode, we're going to be discussing Anti-Sedevacantism, and I would like to say, or title it, The Defense of the Indefensible. So, Father, it seems like there's recently, in the last couple of years, been a large increase in condemning Sedevacantism, whether it be Catholic Family News, a host of lawyers writing articles and books. There seems to be no end to the people that are ready to condemn Sedevacantists as the latest nuts out of the nut house.
Well, I think that's generally been the case, but particularly so during the past couple of years because of the election of Bergoglio of Francis. He has done so many outrageous things, so many things that obviously undermined the Catholic faith and the notion of the true church and just about everything we stand for, that people who would not have considered the Sedevacantist position during the days of Benedict or of JP2 now are looking seriously at it. And that is not just a fantasy on my part, but I hear from these people all over the world now as a result of our contacts with True Restoration and our internet apostolate. So there's quite a bit of interest in it. The types in the traditionalist movement that I call the R&R, the recognize and resist types, such as the Pius X Society, Bishop Williamson, the publications that you mentioned, are still pushing the recognize and resist idea, but it's losing credibility, I think, simply because of what Francis is and what he says and what he's doing. So to stanch, as it were, the potential defections to Sedevacantism, these groups have published a number of critiques of Sedevacantism, which, of course, we feel obliged to answer.
And, Father, would you say a large part of it is Benedict XVI, John Paul II, while they did outrageous things, generally they weren't very public. If it was someone was keeping up to speed, they'd be aware of these issues. But for the most part, your average Catholic, your average traditional Catholic, really didn't come across these issues. But today, with Bergoglio so public and so vocal, a matter of fact, it's like he can't keep quiet. These issues just keep staring him in the face.
That's exactly it, and that's what's driving, as it were, the different critiques. The press, the secular press, and to a large extent the religious press, portrayed JP2 and Benedict XVI as great conservatives, and they love to set up different antitheses. And it's a lot easier to say that JP2 is the great conservative, or that Ratzinger is the Rottweiler of orthodoxy, and so that's a glib statement that's easy to make and very easy to write about, to set up these so-called antitheses for the sake of some excitement. So many people, and we swim in the media culture, unfortunately, many Catholics take those analyses rather seriously. And then, JP2, while he did a great number of really crazy things from a theological and liturgical point of view, nevertheless, he gave the impression of being a devout guy who loved Blessed Mother. And the same thing for Benedict XVI. But now there's this man that all these people are confronted with, and his liberal tendencies, his open modernism is something that's very much praised by the secular press, and so he has he has everyone's attention now.
And I think with this show, we're going to give some basic definitions, which most people already know, but I want to cover them just in case we have new listeners. What is a fundamental premise that is found in the traditional Catholic movement that's common among all these different groups?
Well, it's this, that Vatican II is a disaster, and that the liturgy that it led to, the creation of the new Mass in 1969, had really terrible effects on Catholic worship throughout the world, that the new system of laws that was introduced after the Second Vatican Council, based on the principles of the Second Vatican Council, that this led to a disaster as well. And that the new teachings, the new doctrines that came about as a result of Vatican II undermined the Catholic faith and led now 50 years after to what is a disaster and what has been a continuing decline. So all traditionalists of whatever stripe agree on those fundamental principles, that there is a disaster. The difficulty, or we could say the conflict among traditionalists, comes in how do you offer a credible explanation for these new doctrines, these harmful doctrines, discipline, this way of worship that seem to have come from the authority of the Church, when we know that Christ promised his authority to the Church and promised us that the Church could not lead us wrong, could not give us error in her official teachings, or could not give us evil, that is to say, in her universal laws, command things that were evil. So that is where the dispute, as it were, the dispute lies.
And this major dividing line would be, I think you would agree, defined by how we view the papacy. And there's a major dividing line separating into two camps. What are these two camps, and how would you define each?
Well, the R&R, the Recognize and Resist camp, such as the Pius X Society and the Bishop Williamson and the publications that you've mentioned, these are people who are outside the structure of the post-Vatican II Church. Okay, their philosophy is that they recognize the Pope. They recognize post-conciliar popes as true popes, but they resist them. In other words, they ignore their laws, they ignore their teachings, they ignore the rites that they prescribe. So that's one camp. And the other school of thought is the one that I belong to, and we are the Sedevacantists. That term comes from the term in canon law for the vacancy of the Holy See, sede vacante, and we believe that the only way to reconcile the obvious evil of these different officially sanctioned changes in the church and in worship and doctrine and discipline is to say that they did not come from people who had true authority from Christ. So they did not actually come from the authority of Christ himself. So we seek to find an explanation for that, and the explanation that we reason to based on different principles in Catholic theology is that the post-conciliar popes were public heretics and hence did not have the authority to do what they said they had the authority to do. And that is how one reconciles the infallibility and the indefectibility of the church with the obviously bad things that came from the official documents after Vatican II.
And I think on its face, like we kind of talked before with Bergoglio, it looks like a duck, sounds like a duck, walks like a duck. I think more and more Catholics are seeing Bergoglio for the heretic who he is, regardless of whether they know any theology or not. It's just that in your face.
Yeah, and the thing is that's very striking for me is you even now start to see mentions in the mainstream secular and the mainstream Catholic press of the idea of heresy, and that if the Pope changes the rules on the reception of Holy Communion by people who are divorced or remarried, well, that would border on heresy. That would be a defection. You have people saying this. You have Ross Douthat, something like that, Douthat, who is an op-ed writer for the New York Times, saying something like that. You have Pat Buchanan talking about the possibility of the Pope not really being the Pope if he changes these laws and changes these rules, and actually mentioning the word Sedevacantism, the possibility that the see is vacant. So this sort of stuff is it's in the air because of Bergoglio. That's what he has provoked. And I mean, if you would have told me, even 10 years ago that there would be widespread discussions like this and the sort of interest in Sedevacantism that has developed, I would have said, well, we're going to have to wait a long time for that. But Bergoglio has moved the clock forward.
And with this acceleration, there's been just a real, to me, it appears a desperate response to cling to a previous position. And they're digging up all these theology manuals to support their position, and it leaves the layperson in a very difficult situation, because here on one hand you have one opinion giving theology to support it, and on the other side you have an opinion that gives theology to support it. So I really want to analyze what is the theological basis for both. And so in discussing the R&R argument, what is the theological basis for this? What are the writers, the theologians that they cite, and why are these particular theologians not applicable in this case?
Okay. Well, first of all, there's the general difficulty with their position is that the whole idea of the theologians to whom they appeal for the idea of resistance to the Pope, actually they are dead wrong in interpreting those theologians that way. There are only a couple that they endlessly cite. I think Vittoria's is one. They cite one passage of Bellarmine, and I think something from Peter Lombard. But that in itself, I think, would make an interesting show. So generally, for their position, there are substantial holes in their resistance argument. But apart from that, if we talk specifically about the question of the Pope and loss of papal office, since the advent of Sedevacantism position. Different writers have who embrace the R&R position, such as Michael Davies and later Christopher Ferreira, have pointed to a small group of theologians in the 16th and 17th century who discussed the possibility of a heretical pope. Cajetan's Suarez, Paul Lehmann, and John of St. Thomas. And the solution to the question of a heretical pope that the 16th and 17th century theologians gave was that they said it was possible for someone to sitting on the throne of Peter to become a heretic. That was a possibility. The question is, well, what happens to him? Well, their conclusion was essentially this: that you have to have a trial, in effect, to depose him. You give him different warnings, and then you depose him from his office. At that point, he loses his papal power. So that those are the theologians, the four theologians primarily that they rely on. The Sedevacantists rely on a line of theologians that's essentially was beginning with Robert Bellarmine, who articulated a position saying that since faith is necessary for membership in the church in addition to baptism, if a pope, just like anyone else, publicly professed heresy, he would put himself outside the church. And to be the head of the church, you have to be a member of the church. And so he would automatically lose his power. He would not have to be put on trial. So Bellarmine was tremendously influential in this question. And it was his position that subsequently was adopted by the majority of Catholic theologians, and then by the 20th century, the beginning of the 20th century, it was virtually unanimous among the theologians who wrote about the question of a heretical pope. So the R&R people have adhered to and continue to push an abandoned theological position that Catholic theologians eventually turned their backs on because they saw the sense of Bellarmine's argument that faith is required for membership in the church, and to hold office in the church, you lose the faith publicly, you break that bond of adherence to what holds the church together, and you put yourself outside it. So that hasn't kept the R&R camp from continually repeating these arguments that have been discredited. In fact, one of them, even Bellarmine himself, Cajetan, he spent about 4 pages refuting Cajetan.
And just so I think so the listener understands, at least from my understanding, you can correct me if I'm wrong, Bellarmine synthesized or summarized an opinion that he discerned was from tradition and the early church fathers' writings, I understand. Is that not true?
Oh, yes, that's right. And he did a great deal of research on that. And, of course, it was much more difficult in those days when you didn't have the Internet. So theologians like this are extraordinarily impressive sometimes when you see what they're able to amass in the way of proofs for their arguments. So, I mean, he established it as very much part of tradition.
So, Father, you said there was a moral consensus among the theologians just prior to Vatican II on this issue. At what point do you know the Church has accepted a certain theological position?
Well, they appear in the way that works in theology is they appear in approved theological manuals. So, for instance, you have these massive works like the Verens Vidal commentary on the Code of Canon Law that is written by a professor at the Gregorian University in Rome. You have Coronata, his Institutiones Juris Canonici. He's another big gun at a pontifical university, the head of the theology department or the canon law department. So all of these writers, these theologians, were in positions of responsibility, and their manuals, the Latin manuals that they wrote, these multi-volume works, were considered, to be authoritative in a certain sense, that they were approved, they contained nothing contrary to the Catholic faith, and they did what theologians are supposed to do and canonists are supposed to do, which is take the doctrines of the church, apply them, take the laws of the church, and give a correct interpretation of them, so that they can be up. So you can't just say, oh, well, it's just the opinion of the theologian. If they all agree on something, then that is a more than probable opinion. You can accept it with certainty, especially if you look at the reasoning.
And that would be a common consensus at a given time. We're not talking about a common consensus from the beginning of the church necessarily to our given point in time, but if the theologians in general at any point in time have a moral consensus that would have doctrinally safe
and not only, and more than doctrinally safe, but certain, because if you look at the reasoning that these guys use, the tight reasoning, they're not just saying things off the top of their head. So there is this it's a real type of authority that they have, real sort of intellectual authority, where they prove their arguments at every point in a very tight fashion. So that's what you end up with something that's certain.
So it'd be like going back to cite St. Thomas on the Immaculate Conception versus the turn of the 19th century, when all the theologians agreed that the Immaculate Conception was the doctrine of the Church.
Yeah, because what happens in theology is that what these people are paid to and fed good Italian meals for is to research and think and look at what other theologians say, and that's how the whole discipline is built up, and that's how you come to a certitude on these different issues. And then eventually you get to a point, we'll talk about this when we go into Fenianism and baptism of blood, baptism of desire, that if there's a universal consensus among theologians about a doctrine, then it is, and expressed in a certain way, then there is an obligation to accept it, because it ends up being part of the universal ordinary magisterium. Everyone teaches it. Now, I'm not saying that that's necessarily where we've arrived at with this issue, because not everyone talks about the question of a heretical pope, but it's somewhat the same flavor, that you end up with something that's more than certain.
And so, besides theological writings, is there any sort of papal documents we have to support the Sedevacantist opinion? Any bulls, encyclicals of these sort to lend credibility?
Yeah, well, the most significant one, which actually was a later discovery among traditionalists, unfortunately, again, because it's so hard to do research, at least in the beginning days of the movement, was Cum ex Apostolatus Officio of Paul IV in 1559. And he was facing an actual situation with a cardinal named Morone, whom he suspected of being a crypto-Lutheran. So he promulgated this bull, and this is a papal law, saying that if someone had been a heretic before and had defected from the Catholic faith, was elected to the papacy, his election would be invalid, and his acts would have no juridical force. So there's this whole list of blood-curdling prohibitions that he attached to it. So what happened is that the 16th and 17th century opinions that you had of Suarez and Cajetan and Lehman and John of St. Thomas on the question of the Pope, that these in effect were neutralized in the practical order because of this bull of Paul IV, which was signed also by all the cardinals. idea that one would have to have a trial. And he said specifically, that he would lose his office and authority without any declaration. And it was this idea of having a trial and declaration that theologians like Suarez and Cajetan and company insisted was necessary, and that the R&R people insist is necessary as well. So the whole opinion was completely neutered by Paul IV's Cum Ex Apostolatus Officio.
But modern theologians even cite a need for declaration in the case of a pope becoming a heretic. Why then are these modern theologians just prior Vatican II, citing a need for declaration? What is the purpose of it?
Okay, so there it is. That issue has to do with a what's called provisio canonica, the appointment to someone of a canonical office. That the Code of Canon Law specifies that if an office, if a church office is occupied by someone illegitimately somehow, the person or the body of electors that has the right to appoint someone to that office has to issue a declaration saying that this guy that the fellow who's currently functioning as a bishop or whatever is doing so illegally, doesn't have the right to do it. So, and this is an important provision in De Personis section, the general section that gives the general principles for the appointment to different church offices. So it's laid down that you have to have a declaration. So if it's a bishop who is appointing someone to parish and the former pastor doesn't want to leave and is still continuing to function as pastor, the bishop has to issue a declaration. And the same thing for, say, the bishop of a diocese. Say that there's an intruder, a guy who's been intruded, let's say, as the bishop of Esztergom in Hungary by the communist government, and he continues to go around and function as if he were truly the Archbishop of Esztergom, and the Pope wants to appoint someone. He has to declare the current occupant's possession of the office to be illegal. So that's what they're talking about here. They're talking about someone who, in the case of a pope, someone who has no legal right. So the presumption would be that, okay, the pope turns into a heretic, and the cardinals has the right to elect a new pope. So they say, all right, this guy obviously has no authority, but hey, he's not leaving the apostolic palace. Right, or I don't know what he's continuing to appoint bishops, or I don't know, he's still riding around in the Pope mobile. Okay, if we were in normal times, let's say. So you have to. He's still acting as Pope, so we have he's a heretic. He's lost his power. He can't command us to do anything, but we have to issue a declaration that the new guy that we're going to elect is going to be the Pope, and this old one doesn't have any right to the office. So that's how it works. It's
in the video that you did that covered some of these topics called "Stuck in the Rut," you used the analogy of a death certificate. Somebody dies; it can be quite obvious that person is dead, but there's a legal proceeding then to follow to declare it such and make it official.
Yes, that's right. And the idea is that when you do something like that, that starts the whole process to allow someone else to get his goods and his possessions. Okay, but you got to have the death certificate. It's actually the same thing in a papal election, that when the Pope dies, there are several curial officials who, in effect, have to issue a death certificate, and that kicks off the whole process of electing a new pope. Some theologians, by the way, say that heresy in a pope, heresy is the moral equivalent of death. So that one is to put someone else in the office, you have to have this certificate.
And from the R&R legal defense team, they'd almost be purporting the position that everyone can see the man is dead, he's not breathing, but we can't let ourselves think that until you have a public official tell us.
That's basically it. That he is not really dead, really dead, unless some doctor signs the death certificate. But it's to mix up two things. It's to mix up the level of reality with legality and legal human law, as it were. So and that is the problem. Their argument, not in effect, but in reality, is that you can't even think that one of the post-Vatican II popes is a pope until you have a bunch of cardinals get together and say that, well, he's a heretic, we've given him 15 warnings or whatever is required, and now we can think that he's not, you can all think that he's not the pope. But it doesn't, it does not work that way. It's not supposed to work that way, because what cuts you off is the defection from the faith, according to these theologians.
And just to summarize this position, and one more point I want to cover is at Vatican I, which would have been a council on the papacy, did this question arise? Is there any sort of documentation of this question at the council, and how was it addressed?
Yeah, and this is one of the wonderful things about the internet. That I don't know, I came across this on some site, and it was Archbishop Purcell, who was one of the archbishops of Cincinnati, and he said that the question of papal heresy was raised. Someone raised that in the aula, in the hall, or in the place where the council was being held, and the theological commission answered the question and said, well, it was unlikely it would ever happen, but that from the moment that the Pope became a public heretic, he would put himself outside the church and he'd no longer be Pope. And this was the answer given at Vatican I, which is ironic, because so often Sedevacantists, whose position was based on this notion of a heretical pope automatically losing his office, are accused of being against Vatican I. And here you have the question asked and answered at Vatican I, and we have the testimony to it by one of the fathers of Vatican I, Archbishop Purcell. Not only that, I believe it's also in the theological manual of Serapius Iragui. I think he talks about that as well. So it's not, the idea of a heretical pope is not inconceivable, because you had Paul IV talking about the possibility. You also had Innocent III talking about the possibility. You have theologians talking about it and outlining the different theories. And you have the question raised at Vatican I. So there is an unassailable theological basis to the fundamental principle that Sedevacantists are talking about.
And I guess a common accusation that goes alongside with that is you're judging the Pope, you're judging the Holy Father. Who are you to judge? I think they're taking a line from Bergoglio. Maybe he's stealing it from them. I don't know.
Think that was in a different context.
But in the case that a private individual can't judge, does the cardinals or even a council of the church, would that have any more authority to judge a sovereign pontiff as pontiff?
No, you couldn't, because he can't be subject to, because he's the supreme legislator in the church, he can't be subject to his inferiors. So it knocks him out. It knocks him out automatically. And one of the theologians who writes about the question of heretical pope. In fact, I think it's Serapius Uragui. He quotes one of Innocent III's consecration sermons, or his coronation sermons, where Innocent III says that, well, the Pope can in fact fall away to heresy, and he says, "Iam judicatus est," that he is already judged. He is already judged by God, and he withers away into heresy. So that is that's definitely a possibility. The other thing is that look, and I talk about this in the video, certain things don't stand what arguments are said by lawyers not to stand the red face test. And in other words, the idea is if you make an argument in public and your face turns red, chances are it's not a very good argument. So what you have with the R&R on this particular argument of following the wrong theologians whose opinions were discarded, is that when you boil it down to practical order, who do you have to judge people like Bergoglio? They all adhere to the same heresies that he does, the same fundamental heresies that he does, the whole set of Vatican II heresies. And what, you're going to have someone like Casper, Cardinal Casper, or Maradiaga, or Mahoney, or the guy from Germany, or Cardinal Schönborn, the balloon-carrying Cardinal Schönborn, or the cheesehead Archbishop of New York. These people are going to accuse Bergoglio of heresy. You know, the prospect is ridiculous.
Perhaps Cardinal Dolan would accuse Bergoglio of heresy if he became a Bears fan.
Yeah, or something like that. And I think if you are attentive to the soundtrack of that section of Stuck in the Rut, as the cardinals are introduced, you will hear some very impressive trumpet fanfares and a little organ piece that suddenly offers a little opinion in the way of its tune, on the idea of having these cardinals judge the Pope. And the tune it just sort of turns into, actually, is "Send in the Clowns," which is what the R&R people are asking us to do. Send in those clowns.
Now, one more little twist I'd like to ask, or angle I'll get sometimes from these rabid anti-Sedevacantists is, well, a future pope will judge this current pope to have been a heretic. And my thought is, if we go have the principle of only a superior can judge, even a future pope is only an equal if this current man is still the pope.
Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense. And the principle is parum parum non habet potestatem, so that an equal doesn't have power over another equal. So the whole idea is cooked from the beginning, you know. And then one thinks of all of the other practical ramifications that would have in terms of the interpretation of law, and it's really a crazy solution. And no theologian says that. No theologian says that. So as usual, it's one of the many myths that have been made up to surround this particular issue.
Well, I think that kind of wraps up the first part of the show. And before we move on to the second part and analyzing a new perspective to look at the papacy today, or the issue of the papacy, I would like to remind you that you're listening to Trad Controversies on the Restoration Radio Network. I'm your host, James Schrepfer, and I am joined by Father Anthony Cekada from St. Gertrude the Great Church. And today we've been discussing Anti-Sedevacantism, the defense of the indefensible. We want to remind you that Trad Controversies is a production of the Restoration Radio Network. All rights are reserved, and any duplication without explicit written permission is forbidden. To obtain permission, please write to mail@truerestoration.org. And so, Father, we've really been talking about an old discussion because today, with Benedict XVI, Bergoglio, we really have a new issue that the R&R camp hasn't even addressed. What is this new issue?
Well, the issue is that in the process of researching the question of the heretical pope, we also discovered that, in fact, the same theologians who teach that a heretical pope would fall from office also state very clearly that a person who is a public heretic cannot validly become pope. And that is an impediment of divine law. So if you go to some of the same 20th century theological manuals, you'll find that that teaching very clearly expressed that when the canonists or theologians talk about the requisite qualifications for someone to be validly elected pope, they say that someone who is a public heretic is excluded by divine law. And they make it's interesting. They make no distinction as far as someone who has received a condemnatory sentence or anything like that. They just say a heretic, a public heretic, is prohibited by divine law from becoming pope. So that's something that's rather striking, and that, of course, is the case we would maintain with someone like J.P. Toon, Ratzinger, and Bergoglio, that they embraced different heresies before they were elected, and so there's not a question now of some sort of a trial of them, certainly not by the clownish cardinals, but that they never obtained true papal authority in the first place. But see, that is, again, that's consistent with the fundamental theological principle that we enunciated at the beginning of the program, that you have to have two things. You have to have baptism and adherence to the faith to be and to continue to be a member of the church. And if you don't have that adherence to the faith, you're not a member of the church. If it's a public, if you do not publicly adhere to it anymore, and therefore you're incapable of having authority in the church. So it's the principle of divine law of pope being impeded from obtaining papal power, or let's say someone who is nominated or elected, that impediment preventing him from being validly elected or becoming a true pope is something that's clearly derived from that very simple theological principle. So it's not a question of holding. Yep, it's not a question of holding a trial. The thing is that the guy's a heretic beforehand, so he has nothing to lose. He has no papacy to lose.
And here is Coronata, who you cite among multiple other theologians. He says, appointment of the office of the primacy, number one, what is required by divine law for this appointment? Also required for validity is that the appointment be of a member of the church. Heretics and apostates, at least public ones, are therefore excluded. And you cite multiple theologians who essentially say the same thing.
Yeah, so essentially now that is the underlying principle for the Sedevacantist argument, that these men did not truly obtain the office in the first place because they weren't Catholics beforehand.
And I think I'd just like to spend a little time to review what exactly is heresy and what constitutes a heretic.
All right, well, that's a big issue, or is widely discussed, as it were, among trads. A lot of people have different opinions, but the only opinions that count are the opinions of the theologians and canonists. So if you go through the manuals and you go through the commentaries, what you find is the essential definition is Canon 1325.2, is this. A heretic is one who, after the reception of baptism, pertinaciously denies or doubts any of the truths to be believed by divine and Catholic faith. So that it's a simple definition. After this, so you have to be baptized, then you have to deny or doubt any of the truths to be believed by divine and Catholic faith, and you have to do that pertinaciously. So the authors talk about that. They say that, for instance, the theologian Michel, writing in this massive dictionary of Catholic theology, gives a threefold distinction. He says there's a question here of dogma, which is heresy is false doctrine. Then secondly, there's a question of the moral question of heresy. Heresy is a sin. And the third, heresy is a canonical crime. So he says that, what you deny has to be an article of divine Catholic faith, and that the teaching of the universal ordinary magisterium suffices, and that as regards denying a doctrine, you can deny the doctrine in explicit terms or in equivalent terms, and you can do this either through what they call a contradictory proposition, which would be something like Christ is not the Son of God. That's contradictory. Or a contrary proposition, which substitutes something else, where you say Christ was an angel. Okay? And then if you doubt it, if you suspend judgment about a dogma and express that, then that too falls under the level of heresy. So that's what gets you started out at the dogmatic level. And then the question of interest is, and that these theologians go into, this Michel and also a man named Mackenzie in a Catholic University thesis, they talk about the question of heresy as a sin. Now, in the different anti-Sedevacantist treatises, they tend to mix up the notion of heresy as a sin and heresy as an offense against church law. But all the theologians talk about this, that heresy has to be a sin, and sin first, and the intellect has to work, and the will has to work. So you grasp that God and the church testify to the truth of a certain teaching, okay, and say something like the eternal punishments of hell, and you know that the church teaches that. But then there's an act of the will where deliberately and obstinately turn your attention away from that authority of the church, and you want to substitute other considerations that are opposed to or that cast doubt on that teaching. And so that's how it works. So you've got there's this dogmatic element, and then the moral element. There's an intellect, and then there's there's act of the will. So that's how the sin works. And the writers such as Mackenzie and Michel talk about the psychology of the sin of heresy.
So to use an analogy to see if I'm understanding this right, what you're saying is heresy is a sin, or heresy can be also classified as a crime. And to use an analogy, I would put it from a layman person's perspective, murder is a sin. It's against God's law, but murder is also against the public law, and those are two separate issues.
Yes, that's right. And that distinction is clearly expressed in the writings of canonists and moral theologians, that you have something as a sin, and then to certain sins that are particularly bad, the church herself would make a crime in terms of her own law. So that's the two things.
And to go to the meaning of pertinacity, because it's often cited, well, the person has to be warned 3 times, 10 times, 15 times, maybe breakfast, lunch, and dinner. What exactly is the meaning of pertinacious?
Okay, in terms of the sin, the theologians say that, okay, because heresy is you're making this erroneous judgment, all right, all you have to do is knowingly and willingly express your erroneous judgment about a doctrine in opposition to the church's magisterium. So that they say that from the moment one sufficiently knows the existence of the rule of faith in the church, and that on any one point whatsoever, for whatever motive, whatever form, you refuse to submit to it, then it's the formal sin of heresy, and it's complete. And the authors go on and on about saying that, well, this doesn't pertinacity in heresy doesn't mean that you stick with it for like a long time, or that you get warnings from the church. They say that that this is something that's not necessary. One of the authors, Coronata, says it's not required that the person who commits it remain in heresy for a long time. Even a moment's time suffices for pertinacity.
And so pertinacity in relation to the crime, though, all that has to be demonstrated then, if I'm discerning this right, all that has to be demonstrated for the crime to have been committed is that the person that is saying this heresy knows it's contrary to the teaching of the church.
Yeah, and the presumption is that he knows. That's the presumption of a law, because, and indeed of all actions in general, that you're knowingly, you're acting as knowingly and willingly as a human being. So, but even for the simple crime of heresy, the idea is that the idea of warnings doesn't even come into the second level, second or third level. That there are 6 levels, as it were, of the crime of heresy that authors such as Zalba and Rigatello talk about, and the idea of a warning only comes into the second level. That at the first level, there's just a simple crime, and you are pertinacious at that point for having committed the crime. You know the rule of faith, and you say something else.
And so a couple of terms that are often confusing for people or thrown out there in these articles today are formal heresy, formal heretic, material heretic versus public heretic and private heretic. What are the differences between these terms?
The 4 words that you've used are actually that's a division applying to 2 different things. The public versus private heretic. Okay, that's a distinction. Is that the heretical act is only known, let's say, to a few people, and is fundamentally hidden. So it was also called occult heresy. And then the other type of heresy is public, and the older commentaries will use that interchangeably with public or notorious or manifest, etc. And that means that it was done before a larger number of people, or that it was done in such a way that you reasonably suspect that people were going to find out about it. So that's one distinction. And with that in mind, if you keep that in mind, you say that the public, remember, if we go back to our general principle at the beginning of the show, that public heresy separates you from the body of the church, okay, because you have to profess the faith, as it were, publicly. So that's the first distinction as far as the forum goes for it. The second distinction, when we're talking about the sin of heresy, has to do with the moral act, the question of the question of sin, the question of sin or not. So what you can have is you can have someone who could make a statement that was against defined dogma of the church, but he does that out of stupidity. he has and the canonists talk about this. They talk about the rudes and rustici and people who have different wrong religious ideas, but they don't have, as part of their intellect, the idea that God and the Church have testified to the truth of something that's the opposite of what they're saying. Okay, so they're not guilty of heresy. Materially. That's a case of material heresy, or material. The case too of material heresy would be one of someone who was raised in a some sort of non-Catholic sect, and who held the certain heretical ideas of the sect and never really got beyond that to understand it. So that's the intellect side that one expresses this false dogmatic assertion out of ignorance. But the formal heresy then adds to that idea not only the expression of a false doctrine, but there's a deliberate and there's an obstinacy to it that you say, okay, that the Church teaches one thing, but I have all of these different other considerations, and these seem very important to me, and you go back and forth between the two of them, and the way the moralists and theologians describe the psychology of this is that the will forces you to to ignore the testimony of the Church, the extrinsic evidence for the truth of something, and to go, as it were, with other arguments, and you end up denying the doctrine that's taught by the Church. And that can happen. One of them says it can happen in a moment's notice. But and when you express that publicly, it's formal heresy. It's the sin of formal heresy, and it's also subject to crime. But that's another issue.
But in the case of identifying members of the Church, does it matter if it's a formal heretic or a material heretic? Does that make a difference? Because a Protestant, I often hear, well, Bergoglio's a material heretic. You can't judge him. He's still a member of the Church. But a Protestant could also be a material heretic. Is that not true? And if I was to take Bergoglio as a material heretic as a member of the Church, I would also have to take this Protestant.
Yeah, that's precisely it. Okay, so that indeed is the problem. If we go to the question of, first of all, the sins of formal heresy with someone like Bergoglio and Ratzinger and so on, there's no question that they are formal heretics, that they know what the rule of faith was, and they're modernists. They deny the rule of faith. Ratzinger has heard somewhere that, well, the Church is one and undivided in herself and separate from all others, which is Catholic teaching. But he comes up with the Frankenchurch heresy, which undermines that dogma of the faith and turns it into mush. So he is a formal heretic. Or Bergoglio, obviously, he has heard somewhere probably that marriage is indissoluble, and that the punishments of hell are eternal, okay? But yet he comes up with a theory of the annihilation of souls who do not go to heaven. And that, of course, that's a contrary proposition that denies something that's de fide divina et catholica, et definita. So those people are formal heretics. There's no question about it. The R&R camp is inclined to say that, well, there has to be a judicial process to ascertain this, but we're talking from the level of sin. Even if that were true, if you want to say, okay, they're not formal heretics, right? That they're simply material heretics. Well, then the material heretics are public material heretics are not considered members of the church either. So you correctly discern that when it comes to these different Protestants, that they are in many of them are in good faith and so on. And if you maintain that, well, their material heresy doesn't take you out of the Catholic Church, then you would have to accept them as part of the church. And as the theologian Van Noort pointed out, that then this would destroy the visibility of the church and the integrity of the Catholic faith. So even if you maintain that, well, no, Bergoglio and company are not formal heretics, the argument is cooked even on the question of material heretics, because it's the public material heretics, clearly the teaching is that they're not members of the church. So you end up with a theological the argument that's indefensible.
Here's Father Berry, the Church of Christ, page 128, and here he says, so far as exclusion from the church is concerned, it matters not whether the heresy or schism be formal or material. And another author I've commonly seen is Ott, and he says on page 311, open apostates and heretics, public heretics, even those who err in good faith, material heretics, do not belong to the body of the church. So it seems to me that the theologians have taught quite definitively that public heretics, whether they're formal or material, are not in the church.
Yes, and it was confirmed. Van Noort says it. The theologian Van Noort, in his Christ Church, one of the several volumes that he produced, says that it is, that is confirmed by Mystici Corporis of Pius XII, and he quotes Pius XII about the sin of heresy being one that takes one out of the church. So it could not be clearer. It could not be clearer.
So I guess the last question we would have is, given that this argument that they were heretics prior to their election, both Bergoglio and Ratzinger wrote a number of public books, and were there any heresies found in these?
Yeah, and there were this indeed would make another very good show on Catholic controversies. But Ratzinger's whole, his fingerprints are over all sorts of horrible stuff, going all the way back to the 50s. And then what you have you have Bergoglio. He wrote this awful book, Between Heaven and Earth, with this Rabbi Skorka. So the Bishop Sanborn has gone through that book and named and given chapter and verse on his heresies there. But even apart from that, the baseline heresies of the conciliar church are bad enough. The idea that between Lumen Gentium and the Frankenchurch heresy, they deny the unity of the church. They also deny the idea that the Catholic Church is the sole means of salvation, and that's in their official teaching. So while you can spice things up by going through Ratzinger's writings and Bergoglio's writings, whatever sort of spice they use down there in Argentina, the fact of the matter is that they all adhere to the same heresies, to the same errors as the rest of the members of the conciliar church.
Well, even if we ignore all the chili pepper, the flavoring that they add in a number of heresies, they all are modernists. They're open, public modernists, and modernism is condemned by the church as heresy. Is that not true?
Yes, because what it does is it renders virtually impossible the idea of making anything into a dogma. that everything is turned into mush. While the empty formula may be retained of some dogmatic formula, the sense of it has changed, and of course, it's not the words that count, but it's the sense. It's a sense in theology, and that is precisely what modernists do. That they empty the standard doctrinal formulations of the correct sense and the correct meaning, and that is the poison of their heresy. And so it's worse than something like Luther. It's worse than Arius, because at least when they used words, you knew what they were talking about. But with the modernists, it is this giant game of concealment, and that's what we see being played out. We see it being played out in spades with Bergoglio, what he's up to.
And so, just to kind of wrap up the show, I know we're running out of time here. You wrote an article a number of years ago dealing with common objections of these lawyers and a host of other writers, anti-Sedevacantists, bring up. What was the name of that article again? We could reference.
Well, I did. I've included these in a number of them, but the latest one is published on the internet, and it's entitled "Bergoglio's Got Nothing to Lose," and it lists at the end the common objections that one finds to Sedevacantism. And all of these are very easily answered in just a few phrases. All you have to do is get refer to some different arguments and different theological manuals, and the answers, the problems, the objections that are supposedly raised are really non-problems.
One I don't think you touched on in the video, Stuck in the Rut, which is an excellent video, and I suggest listeners to go find it on the internet and watch it. But it's one I often hear of. The Sedevacantism is making a rash judgment, or is using rash judgment. The first thought in my mind is, well, the anti-Sedevacantism have a lack of judgment, but
that argument gives me a rash. It's dumb, because rash judgment is, one of our sixth graders can tell you that a rash judgment is one that you make without evidence. And the evidence of the error, of the pertinacious error of all these people, is all over the place. And you see it played out. In the case of Bergoglio, you see it almost whenever he speaks. So the idea is that there is plenty of evidence, and it's not a judgment that's rash at all. One is also, don't forget, all traditionalists are making a judgment on the effects of Vatican II. And you look at the evidence that's in front of your eyes, and you look at it in a realistic way, and you see that it was a disaster. So you make a judgment on the basis of that, and the judgment on the authority of implicit in that judgment that Vatican II was a mess. Implicit in that judgment is a judgment on the authority that it could not have come from the authority of the Church. It's like a flashing hand pointing at the balcony of St. Peter's, the Loggia of St. Peter's, saying that the Church is a mess, and the explanation for this is that these guys are not real popes. They didn't have authority. It's like a flashing sign. So you make one judgment, and if you think it out logically, it should lead you to another judgment. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to look at Catholic doctrines and Catholic principles and make practical judgments and apply them.
Well, if we're making the practical judgment, he's not the Pope, and they're accusing us of making a judgment, flip the coin around, they're making the judgment he is the Pope. in one way or the other, we have to make a judgment. Otherwise, you're just going around in doubt and you don't know either way.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, because everyone recognizes you have to do something with the question of authority. And even if your theological education is only very dim, and you haven't had much, you know that the question of the Pope is very, very important for a Catholic, and that's something that has to be settled one way or another.
And Sedevacantists base their private judgment, what they discern, on objective criteria. And I think, Father, what you started out at the beginning of the show, one of the objective criteria in order to be Pope is that one is Catholic.
Yes, and indeed that one is Catholic. You expect the Pope to be Catholic. I was, if I could indulge in an anecdote, I go occasionally to swim over at the YMCA to swim laps, and there was a young kid, like a 7-year-old or something, and one of the counselors for the day camp was taking care of this kid, and the kid had come in early, and I'm listening to this counselor handle this little kid, and he asked the kid, or the kid says, well, what are we going to do? And the counselor said, well, we're going to do X, Y, Z and everything. And the kid says to the counselor, am I going to learn how to swim? And the counselor says, dude, is the Pope Catholic? So, I mean, even they expect the Pope to be Catholic.
So he really left the poor kid confused. Oh, dear.
Anyway.
Well, Father, I guess one final thought I had, and maybe you could see if this is fair. To me, these anti-Sedevacantist defense lawyers are like somebody sitting in a room. You have an elderly gentleman across the room, and you see a man walk in and just stab him with a knife. And they're telling us, well, don't make a judgment whether or not he's a murderer. Stay in the room. Don't make any judgment. Stay right in your seat. Just on its face, it seems absurd.
Yeah, these are arguments that are based on sort of a lack of connection with reality, and lack of connection with reality, and also a lack of willingness to understand exactly how the church's legal system, as it were, is supposed to work, how moral theology is supposed to function. And they really don't have the training to do stuff like this, and to deal with these different issues. The fact that generally, attorneys can write and can argue, it gives them, as it were, a certain advantage. But I had an attorney friend tell me that that's one of the dangers all the time, that you're tempted to think that, well, you can argue anything successfully and that you can learn anything successfully, and that is simply that certainly is not the case when it comes to these issues of theology, moral theology, and dogmatic theology and canon law. It's there's a lot to it.
Well, Father, before we leave you for this evening, is there anything else you'd like to add to this discussion before you go?
Well, I think simply to say this, that I made this film, Stuck in the Rut. It's had I think a very good circulation. It has been very effective with many people, and as it were, as objections and responses eventually come in to it, or people require explanations, as I anticipate will happen. Probably in the future, I will make a sequel to it to deal with these questions and these objections. And that apart, I would say that Catholics should try to get the word out about these important issues of authority in the church, and to try to make people look at it more realistically and more in terms that are in conformity with the nature of the church and what we're supposed to believe about the church and her authority and the papacy and so on.
Well, Father Cekada, I want to sincerely thank you for your time, and I'll let you, I know you had supper waiting there, so I won't keep you. But God bless, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Always a pleasure. Take care, James. Bye now.
God bless. If you have any questions for Father Anthony Cekada or feedback on this episode, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us at controversies@truerestoration.org, and we will pass along your questions or comments to Father Cekada. We would like to take this moment to remind you that all correspondence with us is strictly confidential. All of us here at the Restoration Radio Network would ask, if you found this show to be informative, helpful, or in any way beneficial to you and to your faith, that you would please consider sending a note of thanks to the clergy who help make our network worthwhile. Remember that above and beyond material contributions, the most important donation you can make to our work here is prayer. Please think of offering a Mass, a Rosary, or even a simple Ave for our work the next time you pray. For the Restoration, I am James Brooks. May God bless you.
This program was brought to you free of charge by the sponsorship of Novus Ordo Watch. See for yourself that the Church of the Second Vatican Council is not in fact the Catholic Church of the ages. Go to novusordowatch.org. That's novusordowatch.org.